We continue to see reasons about why we should study the Song of Solomon. One reason why we study the Song of Solomon is that it contrasts sensuous love with true love. King Solomon, all he's interested in is finding the most perfect body, and he thinks that's going to be the answer to all of his problems. We're going to see that the shepherd also cares about how the Shulamite looks. That is important to him. But he is interested in her as a person, as a complete person. So we're going to contrast sensuous love with true love, which involves loving the person not only physically, but loving them intellectually as well. And as we think about sensuous love versus true love, I want to talk a little bit about how that right now teenagers face the most difficult time in history in the realm of moral temptation. I want to talk about that a little bit, about why it is that teenagers face the most difficult time in history. Have down here that it is not because of world immorality. You know, we think the world we live in is very immoral. And when we were in California, I don't know if your newspapers here had it in your papers like it did up there, but in our papers, it didn't make the front page, but it made it pretty close to the front page. We had pictures of lesbian and homosexual sororities in the colleges. And it had pictures of the kids who were starting it with their names underneath the pictures so that you didn't have to wonder who any of them were. Just out in the open for everybody to see and to be aware of. And so we do live in a time of where there are a lot of things going on as far as sexual immorality is concerned. But we do not live in the worst time in history as far as sexual immorality is concerned. There have been times in history much worse than ours. In fact, during the couple of centuries before and after our New Testament was written, historians still recognize that period of time as the most sexually immoral period of time that there ever was. So our Bible deals with a time of history that was much more promiscuous than ours is. During this time in Rome was much worse. The Caesars were openly homosexual. You know, I know we're not that bad because during the last presidential election, Gary Hart, who was very popular, he was run out of the primaries because it was discovered that he was committing adultery. Our society is not willing to knowingly elect a man as president whom society at that time knows is committing adultery. So while a lot has gone on in the White House, we tend to find out about it afterwards instead of during or before. But our society still has some limits. It is not as bad yet as Rome. In Rome, the Caesars were openly homosexual. People lived together. Of course, we've got people living together today, but we don't have anything like what they had back during this time. The people living together. Divorce was very easy. One book I read says one woman said that she had 8 husbands in 5 winters. So she was changing husbands pretty quick. They got so that divorce was so easy and tiresome, so that let's just live together rather than have to go through having a divorce. We think pornography is pretty bad in our days, and movies are getting pretty bad, but yet it's nothing like it was back at that time. Now, if we want to go buy a Playboy, we got to go to a 7-Eleven and have some adult get it for us off of the back counter. Well, if we had lived back during Bible times, all we had to do was walk down the streets, and on the outside of the prostitution houses, they had very graphic pictures painted of all of the different sexual positions. This was their advertisement. So all you had to do was walk down the street. In fact, a lot of sexual technique books today, this is where they get their material from, material that was written back before our New Testament was written. So we've still got a ways to go if we're going to be as bad as it's been in the past. During this time, poets gave live readings of pornography. Plato and Socrates, our students have to read about them in junior high and high school, yet most of their writings are depicting homosexual love. They're not love that is proper. So back during this time, these poets would travel from, they didn't have R-rated videos, they just had poets that traveled from place to place and gave live readings of these things. Then, also, if you were a teenager back during this time, your mother or your dad might work in a temple of prostitution as part of their religion. the idolatrous religions. This was something that was very common in them to practice prostitution as religion. If you'd lived back then, your mother might have gone to work or gone to worship her God in this way, felt very good about it. You would have been very proud of it. So we find that really our society, while we may not like a lot of things that are going on in our society, as far as morality is concerned, teenagers today do not live in the worst period of time. Yet I think teenagers do have a tremendous burden placed upon them that has never happened before in time, and that is because of the pressure that is put on them to put off marriage for economics. As I said, the Shulamite maiden was probably 12, 13, maybe 14 years old. Prior to the present age of where we're living right now, people got married a lot earlier than we do today. The mother of Jesus was probably 13 or 14 years old. We tend to think of her as being a lot older woman, but she was probably a very young teenager. My daughter told me the other day in school she learned that Romeo and Juliet were only 14 years old. A lot of us probably have grandparents that got married when they were 14 or 15 or 16 years old. Getting married at a very young age is very common in other countries and has been very common in other times of history. But in the period of time that we live in right now, teenagers are forced to put marriage off because of economics, so that they can earn a living, so that they can support themselves. Boys nowadays, it's no longer good enough to go to high school to support a family. You've got to go to college or some kind of a trade school in order to support your family. There's a lot of pressure on girls to go to college because of easy divorce today. You can't depend on getting married and a man taking care of you for the rest of your life. Or if your husband dies, then you have got to have a means of support in order to provide for yourself. Your parents can't take you in and take care of you like they did during Bible times. During Bible times, if a girl was widowed or divorced, she went back to live with her parents. And they lived off of the land, and she worked and was a productive member of that family, and she helped pay her way in that family. When a young boy and a young girl got married at these young ages, the young girl always went from her home to the boy's home. And we're going to see this in the Song of Solomon as we are seeing their marriage customs in the Song of Solomon. She went from her home to the boy's home, and they became a part of that family unit. Now, it wasn't that they lived in mom and dad's house or mom and dad's tent, as the case may have been. They may have had their own house and their own tent, but they lived on the family compound there. The boy worked with his dad. He already had a means of livelihood, and the girl, she came into that family, and then she took her place as a productive member. So they had their livelihood already planned for them, and this was a lot easier job for them than it is for us now. Now, because of the pressure on teenagers to marry, or not to marry, but to put off marriage, this puts them at a real disadvantage. One author said that the most dangerous person on the face of this earth walking around today is a 17-year-old boy, because of all of his sexual hormones that are affecting his sexual drive and his desires. Now, the question is, did God make a mistake and make 17-year-old boys like that? Or did he intend for 17-year-old boys to have a legitimate outlet for those drives? Up until our time in history, a 17-year-old boy had a legitimate outlet for his drives. And so God didn't make a mistake. It's because of our society's economic setup that a 17-year-old boy is put into a position of constant temptation with no legitimate outlet. So we need to realize that this is a hard time for teenagers, and we need to be supportive of them and realize that this really is not God's ideal, that he designed teenagers and their hormones to have some relief in this way. But as we talk about it's a hard time for teenagers, this is also one of the most exciting times in history to be a woman. And there's several reasons why it is exciting to be a woman in the 1990s. And one of them is because the Bible builds women up. The Bible has a tremendous amount of positive information about being a woman. And because of Victorian morals, that in times past women have not really had access to that knowledge. We bring with us, because of Victorian morals, a lot of prejudice towards women and their role in the church and their relationship with men. And right now is a time of when we are being liberated from Victorian morals, and we can throw off those bonds, and we can come and examine the Bible in a fresh perspective and really understand how really exciting it is to be a woman, how much God loves women, how much responsibility He has for them. Then another reason why this is an exciting time to be a woman is because of some work the feminists have done. About 10 years ago, the feminists decided that they were going to solve this issue for once and for all. If a man if a man was really stronger and better than a woman in certain areas. So what happened was that the feminists flocked to the laboratories to begin conducting all kinds of medical and psychological experiments to scientifically prove there is no difference between men and women. And as the feminists flocked to the laboratories, they did not get the results that they wanted. They began to find that there really were some differences between men and women. So what they tried to do was suppress the release of this information and to keep it hidden. But there have been a great number of scientists who are true to their science, who have personal integrity, who were willing to publish their results. And because of this, we have more physical and scientific evidence today than ever before about the strengths of a man and the strengths of a woman and how they are different. And it is something that can make us have a tremendous delight and confidence in our femininity and to really enjoy being a woman. I have a book up here that I'm going to be sharing some things from it with you as we go through the Song of Solomon, called What's the Difference by Jane Barr Stump. Now, I do not know if Jane Barr Stump is a feminist or not. I cannot tell that from her writing. This little book, all it is, this book has a tremendous bibliography in the back of it, a list of magazine articles and books that she has read. What she has done is she has tried to go through all the literature during the last 10 years that talk about the mental and physical differences between men and women, and she simply records them in this book, kind of like an encyclopedia or a dictionary. She doesn't give you any of her opinion about any of it, just the cold facts, and it's a very fascinating book to read. For example, in this book, they have done experiments on the differences between male and female executives. You know, the feminists are wanting to rise to the top of their field and to be executives. Well, they have found that female executives do not work the same as male executives. A male executive, he goes into his office, he shuts his door, and he does his work, and he allows his secretary to screen his calls, to screen his visitors, and to be a buffer between him and people who distract him from his work. But do you know what female executives do? She goes into her office, and she leaves her door open, and she welcomes anybody who wants to come into her office. She gets up and strolls out among her employees, and she mothers her employees. She nurtures her employees. And so the men rise to higher levels in the office, in the executive world, because they are more businesslike in the way they conduct themselves. Women bring the home with them to their office. They bring their nurturing nature to the office. Okay, I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to take a 10-minute break. And I'd like for you to be back at your seats at 8:15 by that clock back there. There are 2 restrooms down that hall, and there are 2 restrooms right around the corner up here. So let's take a quick break. Okay, I think it's time for us to continue our lesson, and we'll continue for a little bit longer, and then we'll have question and answers if you have some questions. As we continue looking at the purposes for studying the Song of Solomon, another reason for studying it is that it is God's answer to sex education. God has designed the Song of Solomon. You know, the question is, do you have sex education in the schools, or do you have it in the home, or where? And God has designed the Song of Solomon to solve that problem. And because the Song of Solomon is written in poetry, not only does it capture our emotions, but it is also written in a style that makes it very effective to teaching the young children. You can start teaching the Song of Solomon to very young children and just give them the basic storyline of the Shulamite maiden who was in love with the shepherd, but Solomon came along to woo her, and she goes through this dilemma of trying to figure out who it is she should marry. And you can teach them this basic story, and they can understand that. And then as they grow older and become more mature, then you can supply more and more details that they're capable of understanding. So the Song of Solomon really is God's ideal to the question of sex education. And as we think about sex education, we go back to Bible times and think about Jewish women, we want to realize that Jewish women really did look out for each other. They cared about each other and helped each other. And one way they did this is that during childbirth. During childbirth, when a Jewish woman was going to give birth to a child, they had a low stool that she would sit on in a half-reclining position. But when it was time for her to deliver a baby, all of her female relatives and friends would come to where she was, and they would sit around in a circle, and they would be her own personal Lamaze team cheering her on. They would be observing the birth and encouraging her and participating in this, so that when a young girl got married at 13 or 14, however old she was, and began to have babies, when it became time for her to have a baby, she would have watched several births, and she would have known what to expect. She wouldn't have been afraid, and this would have been a time which would have been much easier on her than a lot of times it is on girls today, simply because she would have known what to expect, plus she had her own cheering squad there cheering her on and giving her encouragement. Not only did they support each other in childbirth, but also when it came to sex education, the Jewish women were not timid in this area. When it came time for a young girl to get married, the women would take her aside and they would give her a very liberal sex education. The Jews recognized the woman as the more sexually active and more sexually knowledge of the husband and wife team. And so they would tell her things that she needed to know, that she recognized that she was more in control of this situation. The men would take the boy aside and they would give him some sex education, but in comparison to what the girl got, it was not near as much. So the Jewish women really did look out for each other. When we study the Song of Solomon, we're going to see that the Shulamite says, I know we're going to have a successful marriage because my mother taught me. My mother taught me the things that I need to know. So Jewish women looked out for their daughters. And I'd like for you to open your Bibles and turn to Titus 2, verses 3 through 4. And I know this is a very familiar passage with you, but it's a passage that I think a lot of times we misread. And because we misread it, then we jump to some false conclusions. And here in Titus, it's talking about the older women teaching the younger women. And as you're familiar with this passage, it says that the older women likewise, in verse 3, in Titus 2, verse 3, it says that the older women likewise are to be reverent in their behavior, not malicious gossips, not enslaved to much wine, teaching what is good, that they may encourage the, notice that says young women. When we hear people quote this, or they say the older women are to teach the younger women, all my life I've heard this, younger women. And so for years I have always read this, younger women, until about 3 years ago when it dawned on me this did not say younger women. It says young women. And I remember being a young woman and remember my sister-in-law wanting to teach a class, and she was in her 40s. And she says, I can't teach this class. There are some women in their 50s in this class, and I am younger than they are, and so I can't teach anybody that is older than I am. Well, and this is a typical view that many women have had of this passage, that you have to be older than the people you're teaching or you can't teach because you're supposed to teach the younger women. This passage says that the older women are to teach the young women, and it is probably talking about women who are 13, 14, or 15, women who are getting married, starting their families, and learning these things about taking care of children. So we're living kind of in an artificial society in our view of some of these things. Young women nowadays are older than young women were back then. They're getting married in their 20s and having their children at a later period of time. So what this is talking about, that the older women have a responsibility to teach the young women, the new wives, the new brides, the new mothers, these type of things. And it is not talking anything at all about age comparison between one person teaching someone who is younger than they are. So the older women have a responsibility to teach the young women their responsibilities in this area. So we want to realize that the Jewish women They did care about each other, and they did look out for each other's needs. Now, another reason why we want to study the Song of Solomon is because it has universal application. One reason that I want us to have some time for questions and comments is because I want us to share some of the dating stories and courting stories that different women here have, so that we can see that whatever our age, these are universal truths, that these things about true love are true no matter how old we are, no matter what age we are in. Young women that are here today studying these things, who are 13 and 14 or 11, however old they are, as they study these truths about true love, these are truths that were true for their grandparents and their grandparents before them. These are also truths that are going to be true for their great-great-grandchildren who are colonizing the moon or Mars or wherever it is. These principles are going to always be true and reliable. So these do have universal application. One person we're going to talk about in our class is Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. The king of rock and roll tried to do what Solomon did. He tried to have it all. He was looking for the perfect body. If you watch the movie that was based on the book Priscilla Presley wrote, Elvis and Me, that was out a couple of years ago, and is a fascinating movie to watch and to compare Elvis with Solomon, to see all the similarities in their attitudes and in their actions. So this story does have universal application. It is applicable to our time and the age and when we live in. It is also applicable to the jocks versus the nerds. You know, when I was in high school, we didn't call them jocks or nerds, but we had them anyway. Several years ago, I went to my high school's 20th class reunion, and it was real interesting to see what had happened to the jocks and the nerds. You know, the guys that were the jocks, they were still, their claim to fame here 20 years later was still who could guzzle the most beer. In fact, the guy that won the trophy, what they gave him as a trophy was a huge round trash barrel painted like a beer can. And this was still where he was living. They were still talking about the football plays and how great this was. But you know, the nerds that I went to school with, they were the ones that came to the class reunion in nice business suits. They were the ones that had their own businesses or had high-paying jobs. They were the ones who were successful. So as we study the Song of Solomon, Solomon is going to represent the jocks. The shepherd boyfriend, he's going to represent the nerds. And so we're going to see really that this has universal application. So it applies to all ages, all situations that we have represented here. The Song of Solomon also demonstrates God's love. It demonstrates God's love for teenagers, that God cares about them. He cares about the problems and the temptations that they are facing. He cares about all of us in our relationship, in finding a suitable mate and in being happy. And as I have down here, I have 4 categories of marriage. And I have developed this category, if I have been teaching this material now for about 20 years, then I have observed these 4 categories of marriage. There is courtship that begins before marriage, then there's good marriages, there's problem marriages, and there are desperate marriages. And this picture here, I don't know if you can read the small print up here, this is a picture from a Bible encyclopedia of an Oriental bride decked out in all of her finery to please and capture her husband's attention. Now, I want us to spend a little bit of time talking about these 4 categories of marriages a little bit, these 4 basic marriages. And what I'm going to tell you here is what you can expect to get out of these classes. I have taught lots of 8-week-long series of classes, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about. It's going to be based on talking about an 8-week-long series of class. I have observed that girls who study the Song of Solomon and who learn their role in courtship before they get married, that they make better choices for a husband when they get married and have the inevitable problems that come with marriage. They're not shocked by them. They have ideas on how to solve them. And they start off marriage on a very high plane, and they may have a few ups and downs, but basically their marriage stays on a very high plane that people who learn these things later on never quite achieve. Now, I have just seen this over and over again, that if you can learn it before you get married, you will start marriage off on a higher plane that people who have wonderful and good marriages are not going to quite achieve. And so this should be a strong motivation. Another motivation for studying it in courtship is that a young man who is courting a young girl who is learning these things, It is very easy to get a young boy or a young man to read and study about marriage before you marry him. And if you start trying to do it after you marry him, then it's a lot harder, and depending on the problems, it may be even harder than that. So the idea is not just for her to learn, but for her to motivate the young man to learn and to learn how to initiate certain conversations so that you can solve problems. Then there are people that have the good marriages. What they can expect is, even though they have a good marriage, they can expect it to get better. Good marriages always have room to get better. And one reason why I enjoy teaching these classes is because every time I go through them, my marriage benefits. It reminds me of things that I tend to forget. It makes me appreciate my husband more than ever, and what I get out of it personally, then it makes it profitable for me. So if you have a good marriage, then you expect to see some results. You expect to get better. Then there are people with problem marriages, where there are problems that are actively causing some unhappiness. And I have seen many problem marriages in the course of 8 weeks just completely turn around and become a good, happy marriage, and to level off and to stay in this area. Once the woman learned her responsibilities and her role, God has just simply given women tremendous influence over their husbands. And if they will use this influence like God wants them to, most men are willing to respond. Now, in these desperate marriages, this is when the man is not willing to respond. It's a different case. But in these problem marriages, in fact, many people who think they have a desperate marriage find out that they really only had a problem marriage because their husband did respond, and they come up here and they have this high level of happiness. And I'm going to be sharing some stories with you on some problem marriages to show how this happens. In desperate marriages, these are marriages of where the man does not respond. It's where the man is involved, even though the woman is making all kinds of changes in herself. The man is unwilling to respond. He's involved in some type of sin. There's lots and lots of different types of sin. There's physical and mental and spiritual abuse, but it's not limited to that. There's financial abuse. There's sexual abuse. There's all types of sins that could be going on in this area. And what I have seen in these marriages is that usually they will make some improvement. They will improve some, but they will not come up here to this level, because it does take two to make a marriage. And this is what we're going to be talking about in our second series of 8 lessons of dealing with these kind of marriages where the other half is not responding, he's not doing his part like he should. What I have seen in these marriages is that they get better to a certain degree and they level off, and this may go on for many years. Sometimes it goes on for 20 years. It depends on the woman's degree of emotional strength, how long she is willing to put up with whatever's going on. Some women only put up with it for a year or two, some only for a few months, and then we reach this crisis point. But some of them will put up with it for 20 years until they become emotionally exhausted, and then they cannot put up with it anymore. And a crisis happens here. And when this crisis happens, then something happens to make the man realize he is a part of this, and he has got to be working for the marriage too. When you've got both of them working together, when you do whatever is necessary to get his attention, then it can come up here and it can be great. A lot of times then, when this crisis is reached and the man does not respond and the woman does not bring out the response, then the marriage goes downhill to a lower level and levels off, or it goes on and the marriage disintegrates and it dissolves. So this area right here is what we're going to be talking about in our last 8 weeks, not only for our own benefit, but to help us help people in this type of situation. Because a lot of times we do things that make these people's burden, instead of lifting their burden, we add to their burden and we make their life much more miserable. So that's what we're going to be talking about. But as we talk about what we can expect, the 4 types of marriage, I want to share with you a few stories of marriages that I have seen changes happen in a course of just 8 weeks of concentrated studies. These first 2 examples I'm going to give you are women who were not Christians. This first lady that came to my class was not a Christian. She came over to my house and I met her ahead of time. And this was back when I first started teaching this material nearly 20 years ago, back during short skirts and long-haired hippie days. And this girl came in, and she had long blonde hair and a real short skirt, and her husband came in with her, and he was a real scroungy, long-haired looking hippie. That's the only way I know how to describe him. And I was so turned off by their physical appearance and her talking to me about their marriage problems that I thought, there is no way, there is just absolutely no way I can help this lady. And I tried to talk her out of taking the classes, but she was insistent that she wanted to take them. And as she began to describe their marriage situation, her complaints about her husband was that he had been in this certain job for a long time, and he was such a poor worker that he was continually being passed over for promotions. And so he wasn't hardly earning enough money to take care of them and not doing his part to support them. He would not take care of the car and just wouldn't do anything that was really his job. Worse than that, the first thing he did when he came home from work was he loved on the dog instead of loving on her. So to her, it was a very miserable marriage. She started coming to classes and learning about what God would have her do in marriage. And one week she came to class and she was so angry. And she said, "It's not fair." Have we heard that before? I think I've heard that. It's not fair so many times from women. It's not fair. Why do I have to make all the sacrifices? And all he does is he just sits back and soak it up. It's not fair. Well, once a woman can get past that point and say, I'm going to do these things because God says for me to do them. I'm not going to do them to manipulate my husband. I'm going to do them so that I can be a better Christian. Then that's when you start to see results, because men are very sensitive to being manipulated. Even if we're doing the right thing, but we're doing it to manipulate them, then it's something that turns them off. So once she got over this crisis point, she began to see results. One day she came to class and she says, I was in the bedroom and my husband had a friend over and I overheard them talking. And my husband told my friend, "You wouldn't believe the change in my wife. Watch." He says, "Honey, bring me a glass of water." So she gets up and goes in the kitchen, brings him a glass of water, goes back to the bedroom. He turns to his friend and he says, "See?" Now, in the Song of Solomon, it's going to talk about drinking a drink of pomegranate juice to the beloved. And we're going to talk about that is important to men. That's an important act of love, and we're going to talk about that later. You're going to have to wait till later. But anyway, this gal's husband, he could notice a change. One day she came to class and she says, "My dad took us out to dinner, and my husband pulled the chair out for me, and my dad said, 'Are you pregnant?'" And so all of a sudden she started, and in this course of 8 weeks, this man got a promotion. And this gal was just so excited about all the changes in her marriage that she was seeing just because of her changing. At the same class, there was a lady I had met at a sewing class, and I invited her to come to the classes. And so she called me up, and she says, "I want to find out a little bit about your classes." She said, "Our last daughter just got married, and my husband told the daughter right before she got married, he says, 'Now that you're getting married, I guess your mother and I might as well get a divorce because there's really nothing holding us together.'" And she says, "I'm in the process of trying to figure out what I need to do to support myself to leave my husband. And the only reason I'm taking your classes is because I want to feel good about myself, that I have done everything I can for my marriage before I divorce my husband." So she's taking the class just to make her feel good. So she started coming to class, and she started coming in and telling stories. Early right on, she realized that about 5 years ago, what had started this problem was one day her husband got up and went off to work, and he didn't kiss her goodbye in the morning. So she thought she'd teach him a lesson, and when he came home that evening, she didn't bother to kiss him hello. And it had just gone from bad to worse, and there wasn't any type of affection at all. So she realized she was going to have to undo that. So she decided, and one of our assignments is going to be greeting our husband at the door, but she jumped the gun. She realized this was a problem in her marriage, and she jumped the gun, and she decided she would greet her husband affectionately at the door. So she's there at the door, ready to greet him affectionately as he come in, and as he opened the door, their dogs ran in the house. So she had to go get the dogs and put them out of the house. And while she was getting the dogs, her husband went in the kitchen to get himself a snack. So she went into the kitchen, put her arm around him to love on him a little bit, and he goes, "What do you want?" She hadn't done that for 5 years, so no wonder he's suspicious. So anyway, she goes on about her business, and she would just started making it a habit. Every time she'd go through the living room, she'd go by and give him a little peck, and he'd go, "What do you want?" But she didn't let that faze her. She just kept going on and showing affection for him. Then one day, she decided it wasn't enough to just meet him at the door. They lived out in the country, and she decided she would meet him at the gate. So she watched for her husband coming down the lane, ran out to the gate, opened the gate for him to drive his car through, and he says, "Boy, that's some homecoming." One week she came to class and she says, "You won't believe my husband." She said, "He actually helped me work in the garden. My husband has never, ever helped me work in the garden." And she says, "Not only that, I developed a headache, so he told me to go in the house and lay down and he'd finish it. And in a little bit, he came in the house and he covered me up. My husband has never, ever done that." Well, by the time the 8 weeks was up, she came to the last class and she says, "I want you to know what my husband did this morning at breakfast." She said when she talked to me about coming to the classes, she told me that her husband was so bitter against her that he resented every mouthful of food that she put in her mouth because he had to pay for it. So this is how bitter this man was against her. So anyway, that last class that she came to that morning, her husband told her, he says, "Honey, I've got a $350 bonus at work, and I want you to take this money and go buy yourself some new clothes because I've been spending a lot of money on myself lately." So here's a woman just in a matter of a few weeks, by her learning her role, completely changed that man's attitude. The last time I taught the classes on Song of Solomon, when we were in California, had a lady in the congregation there whose husband was not a Christian. This woman's husband was what I would call a unreasonable, compulsive perfectionist. He was a very bitter and grouchy type of a man. He was always complaining. Nobody could do anything to suit him. There's a lot of times when she would come to services and just almost be in tears because he had been there at the door making her life so miserable. If she went to services twice on one day, he'd tell her, "Well, you just might as well sleep down there as much time as you spend down there." Just always making her life miserable in every area. When this lady became a Christian, it was after she and this man had married. And as she became a Christian, then she quit doing things for him that she had done in the past, like lying for him to help him in his business, telling customers lies and things like this. She told him, "I'm not going to do this anymore." And so he had become very bitter and angry towards the church. When you were around him, you didn't feel like he disliked you as a person, but it was common knowledge that he hated the church because of what he thought it had done to his marriage. So this lady started coming to the classes. She got the books, and she took the books with her to work, and she read them at noon. She did the homework. She put the time in to get the results. And during this week, she talked to me about different things that would come up with her husband and what she could be doing with it. And before the class was over, we had a potluck, and this woman's husband sought me out to talk to me a little bit. And he says, "I want you to know how much I really appreciate your classes. They're really helping my wife." And of course, we all thought he needed some help, too, because of the way he was acting. And I kind of missed an opportunity there. I should have talked to him a little bit about, well, he needed to read these books, too, if there were men that read them, that liked them, and that sort of thing. But I was so shocked by him coming up and talking to me the way he did that I didn't really respond quite in the way I should. And then he told me, he says, I used to think the church was taking my wife away from me, but now I think it's starting to give her back to me. Just within the last month, I have learned that this man has been baptized, and that his wife is just as thrilled and as excited as she can be. But it's because she dared to learn what God wants her to do as a woman that he was able to respond, even this very bitter and resentful man. So we can expect results if we're willing to work on our marriage and to learn the things that God would have us to do. Then these are going to make a difference in our life. Now, as we continue to look at the reasons for studying the Song of Solomon, one of the things that makes the Song of Solomon hard to understand is because of Origen's deceit. Origen was a 2nd century theologian who was so inhibited in regard to the sexual relationship. He thought that if you were a Christian, that even if you were a husband and wife, that you would just willingly give up this nasty, filthy habit of making love with your mate. So this was his attitude towards a sexual relationship. His attitude towards the Song of Solomon was, certainly God could not have inspired a book that dealt with mating love. So Origen tried to get the theologians at that time who were organizing the Bible into one collection of books to leave the Song of Solomon out. But scholars recognized the authenticity and the inspiration of it was so strong that they refused to do that. So Origen said, okay, what I'm going to do is I am going to change the meaning of the Song of Solomon. And he is the one who developed the theory that the Song of Solomon is an analogy of the relationship of Christ to the church or God to the Israelites, depending on the Jews came along and didn't like Origen doing that. So they said it's talking about God and the Israelites. Some of your Bibles up in the headings, it'll say Christ and the church. All of this came from this man's inhibited attitudes towards the sexual relationship. And because of this, people have not been studying the Song of Solomon as they should have. Now, what I have down here is that I want us in this class to deal with our embarrassment, because we're going to be talking about things very frankly. I have had to deal with my embarrassment in dealing with this subject. Years ago, when we first moved to Seattle, I was just a young bride. Barney Cargyle taught the Song of Solomon there. And I was so embarrassed because he kept saying that word, sex, that I did not get one thing out of anything he said. Now, I realize teenagers are exposed to a lot more nowadays than I was at that time, but I've had to deal with that embarrassment. The first time that I have taught some classes on this relationship in a very specific way, it was the first time I had ever said certain words that I had read out loud, and I got so embarrassed I could hardly talk. Linda Cargyle was there. Some of you know her. She's a surgical nurse, and she told me afterwards, she says, I wondered what in the world you were going to say. You were so embarrassed. And that was all, you know. So, but there's one thing about it in dealing with your embarrassment, and I'm talking about this too in regard to teenagers talking with their mothers. A lot of times when teenagers talk with their parents get embarrassed, so they say, well, I'm not ever going to talk to her again or him again, because they get embarrassed. Well, once we're embarrassed, the second time is a lot easier. So if your mother or dad gets embarrassed, give them another chance. The second time is going to be easier. I want us to deal with our embarrassment. Now, these are some things that are improper to talk about. No filthiness, silly talk, coarse jesting, Ephesians 5, 3 through 4. This is something any girl that's from the 5th grade on up, here's a lot of this sort of thing going on in school. Boys talking, making sexual comments, reading sexual things into stories that they're reading in class where there is no sexual involvement at all. There's a lot of this going on in schools, and so teenagers are aware of this and exposed to it. In Ephesians 5:12, where it's disgraceful to speak of things done in secret, this is probably talking about homosexual techniques, that sort of thing. Then in Hebrews 13, verse 4, it says that marriage is to be held in honor and the bed undefiled. So that's what we're going to be doing with marriage, is holding it in honor. In 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 4 through 5, where it tells us to know how to possess our vessel unto sanctification and honor. It's not enough for us to just say, I don't commit fornication or adultery or any of these things, therefore I must be pleasing. That's good, but God says we have to go to the other side of the coin too and use the sexual relationship like God designed for us to use it. It's not enough to know the bad. We have to also know the good if we're going to be living as God would have us to. Then as we think about how it is to prepare for this class, I want you to prepare for this class in 3 ways. In Luke 14, verses 28 through 32, it talks about how no man builds a house unless first he counts the cost. So first of all, I want us to prepare physically. In 1 Corinthians 7, verses 25 through 38, this is where Paul told the Corinthians to give up marriage, to give up buying property, to give up a lot of physical things because of the persecution that was going to come upon them, so that they had the time and the energy to be faithful to God. We're going to have to make some physical sacrifices if we're going to get the most out of this class. That means on Tuesday you do not decide to wallpaper your bathroom. You're not going to be in a fit physical condition to come to class and to get out of it what you need to get out of it. So make plans to be rested and physically well so that you can get out of the class what you should. Prepare emotionally. In Hosea chapter 1, verses 2 through 9, and then in Hosea 3, verses 1 through 2, this is where God told Hosea to go marry a harlot, and each time she left him for him to go and bring her back. And he said, by you marrying this harlot and going through this anguish and heartbreak, then when you preach to my people about how horrible it is for them to be committing spiritual adultery, then you are going to be emotionally prepared. So we need to prepare emotionally for these classes. And one way you can prepare emotionally is by doing your homework early in the week so that you can meditate about it and think about it during the week, and your mind is going to be up with where we are in class, and you're going to be ready to go on to the next point. Then prepare spiritually. In 1 Timothy 4, verses 4 through 5, this is where is the formula for solving every marriage problem. And I have a whole chapter in Volume 1 on this, so I'm not going to be able to teach you that in the few minutes we have left. But basically it's talking about that every marriage problem is solved by going to God and learning His truth, and then going to God in prayer to implement what you have learned into your life. So we need to not only learn, but we need to implement it into our lives.